us, Dr. Dave Schrader has been giving Civil War Roundtable talks to Los Angeles audiences since 2013. He is particularly fascinated by the rest of the story. For example, the activities of support organizations such as the Signal Corps, the Commissary Corps, and the Quartermaster Corps, or people like Lincoln secretaries or ambassadors. And he's given several of these talks for our roundtable over the last few years, and we're very happy to have him back with us again tonight. Most of his talks are interactive, so be prepared for audience participation. And please welcome Dr. Dave Schrader.
So a couple of thank yous to Janet for inviting me again, to you for coming here, because I know there are important things like how many went to see Barbie already as opposed to Oppenheimer.
Oh, darn.
So you have your choices, you know. So how many of you have seen me in action before, just so I get an idea? So you know that I go at a pretty healthy clip. Do I need to use the microphone? Because I prefer to wander around. Okay? You can have all the slides afterwards, so I'll just try to make this entertaining. If you were the kind of student in grade school that sat in the front row and always tried to answer every question and read everything, you will probably get a little frustrated, because my goal is not to read the words to you, but to tell you the stories. And if you want to read all the words, you can get a copy of the PDF and read it on your own time. There'll be plenty of references to books and things that you can take a look at. So I assume that you've probably heard of Beast Butler, right? He's undergoing a little bit of reconsideration. The cover of Civil War Monitor had an article. Of course, it's a lady who wrote a fresh book. And I saw that after I did this talk, so I was kind of heartened to see that the same line of thinking of rehabilitating parts of Butler were also on her mind. Primary sources are these two books. The Devil Came Down to Dixie. He's well known for his activities in New Orleans, and I'll help explain what those were and why some people loved him for what he did, other people hated him. And then this is the pro-Benjamin Butler book that's written by a relative. So you have to take some of that with a grain of salt. So what do you already know about Butler? This is the interactive part.
Oh. What did you call her? Stage actress.
What's that?
What did you call spoons?
Spoons, yeah, we'll talk about spoons.
Carpetbagger?
I'm not sure I would label him that way. Anything else? He was a married man, and you're never going to read much about that. He married a stage actress. He had 4 kids. One died at age 5, one at 26, and the other one lived long lives. People know about Beast. He rescued Washington, D.C. I have a whole talk on Baltimore, and we'll touch on that along the way. He was a political general, and there are only a handful of those, and usually they do not have very good reputations because the military generals didn't really care for them. In his case, he really was not very good at doing military activities, so I would say he's a bungler. And some people would say he's one of the most corrupt people you could ever come across, and we'll talk about some reasons why you might believe that or not believe that by the end of the talk. So we will see. My job is to give you facts. Your job is to interpret the facts and form your own conclusions. So take where you are. I'm thinking about it on a 1 to 10 point scale, 10 being terrible. Right now, we'll see by the end whether the facts persuaded you to change your mind. So these will be the topics. We'll talk about the early years. He was a lawyer. He was in the militia before the war. Fort Monroe, New Orleans, Bermuda 100, Fort Fisher during the war, and then what happened to him afterwards. So he was born in New Hampshire. Sadly, his dad died in the Caribbean of yellow fever. He was the last of 3 kids. He was pretty sickly. He had crossed eyes. He was labeled weak, puny, and indolent. And I'd love to put in the quotes, which are usually in these boxes. So people who practice phrenology, you know what phrenology is? I think that's measuring your head. naturally assumed that he possessed latent disorders that would manifest themselves as he matured. And not off to a very good start. By age 6, he was very smart. He could read the Bible. At Exeter, he got in there. He was small. A student called him a little cockeyed devil, so Butler clubbed him. He also lied a lot. No boy in the country could lie like Ben Butler. At age 10, his mom moved to the mill town of Lowell, Massachusetts, where he lived most of his life, and she took in boarders because she was a widow. But Ben launched a career of larceny, and the mother had to settle up accounts for all the stuff that he stole. So the kid's a bit of a bad boy. Very clever, but a bit of a bad boy. Even Lincoln piled on. And Bruce Catton's book, and Butler's portrayed as a grinning sardonically with eyes that did not mesh, revolving monstrous ambitions in his mind, with his whole soul lack of scruple. So even some of the professional historians don't treat the guy very kindly, right? Would you agree? So he did go to college at what is now Colby. He wanted to go to West Point, but he wasn't going to get in and tried, but did not get in, which led to his not really caring for the West Pointers, which was fine because they didn't really care for him either. He almost got expelled because it was a religious school and he refused to go to chapel. He got very interested in law and began using his law schools on graduation when he only weighed 97 pounds. He had deductions from his academic grades for his ecclesiastical indiscretion, so he ran around wondering if he could file a lawsuit against the school and get out from paying remaining tuition payments. Okay, you getting an idea of what he was like as a kid? A bit of a character. He did study in Lowell under William Smith and was mentored by a judge back then. He didn't go to law school, he did a lot of reading and got mentored. And the test was when he went in and a judge questioned him on facts of law in a case that he had just decided. Ben came back the next day and said, "You didn't decide that correctly." The guy went and researched it and found that Ben was correct. So he actually got his law degree a year earlier than most other people. But his selection of clients was, he was a not too scrupulous practitioner of the law, a very sharp defense lawyer who mingled with thugs and petty thieves. So this continues to paint an interesting picture of Butler as a youth. In Lowell, he actually took the side of people like mill worker women who felt like they were overworked and underpaid. And there were special laws that a woman could not change different mills without getting the permission of the current mill owner. So he went to work with the state legislature and tried to get the hours dropped down to 11.25. He tried to play it both sides, so he told the mill owners, if you don't like what I'm doing, taking these cases by the women, then you need to hire me on the other side of the case. So he could make money either way. In one mill, they had a claim for unpaid wages, so he wanted to legally attach something that was exactly worth the amount of money that the mill owner needed. So what did he try to attach? The water wheel. Which was legally accurate, but it kind of meant that the mill wasn't going to be in business anymore. So you get an idea of how his mind worked. He actually did so well that he hired 2 partners and had the biggest office in Boston for legal. He had 4 times the number of cases. It was the most lucrative law office in New England. And consistent with what I've already told you, politically he kind of switched teams a few times. So he started off as a Democrat, and then when it looked advantageous to be a Republican, he did that, and then he joined a third party towards the end there, and we'll talk about that. But he was a delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 1860. Now that was a pretty messy convention, if you know the history. They adjourned and went to another location, He cast his vote after abstaining on the first 7 rounds for a guy named Jefferson Davis, and he stuck with him for the next 50 rounds. And after 57 ballots, they picked Breckinridge. He got second place. Later on, he completely switched and became a member of the Radical Republican Caucus, which was very anti-slavery, and then after war, he ran for Congress, for governor, and for president. So this guy is all over the place. But pretty amazing that he's like the top lawyer in New England and has time to do all of this, right? But wait, there's more. Oh, there's much more. He was an officer in the militia. He was a colonel in the Lowell militia, and the governor did not like him at all, so he tried to disband the militia. Butler threatened a lawsuit, so the governor changed the boundaries of what guys got to be in the militia from Lowell, and made sure that this annoying lawyer guy was not within that district. So what did Mr. Butler do? No, he didn't sue him. He moved up 1 level. He helped organize the entire state, and then the leaders of all the militia from all the part of the states could choose their leader, and guess who they chose? And he got a promotion along the way. So now he's a brigadier general of volunteers for the Massachusetts militia. So Lincoln wins, Butler goes to D.C., President Buchanan is lame duck, and there's like a collection of 3 people that are envoys to try to negotiate some compromise, and Butler decides to take on the idea of helping Buchanan decide what to do with the envoys. His recommendation is arrest them, and he would be the lawyer for the trial for a small fee. He comes back, he tells the governor of Massachusetts war is coming, our militia is going to need to be outfitted, they will need heavy uniforms, and guess who is a shareholder in some of the Lowell mills that can make all the uniforms? Mr. Butler. So what's coming to mind right now? Words like wheeler dealer, right? That's kind of who he was. So Lincoln's inaugurated, asks for the troops. Simon Cameron, who was Secretary of War, asks for 1,500 men. Butler volunteers and raises 6,000. The 3rd and 6th leave by steamer by way of going down to Fort Monroe in Virginia for Baltimore, and the 8th, with Butler, takes the train. However, there are a few problems. Oh, by the way, he had a few court cases pending that he had to put on hold while he was going off to war. In fact, he had 500 pending cases. I don't know how anybody can do that amount of lawyering, but that shows you what a big hotshot lawyer he and his helpers were. So he was only 22. So he wanted to go fight. If you know your Baltimore, beginning of the history of the war happenings, there was an attack while they were switching trains in Baltimore, and that word got back to him. The bridges were damaged and the communication, the telephone wires were cut, so he's on a train, and the train has to stop because they blew up bridges and other stuff. So he lands his troops in Annapolis at the U.S. Naval Academy, despite the fact that the Maryland governor made it very clear to Lincoln and Scott that they did not, it was a pro-secession state, they did not want any shenanigans going on Maryland soil. Basically, Butler, on his own initiative, said, I am carrying on the war now on my own hook, and when I left Philadelphia, I'm cut loose from my orders. So he basically occupied Baltimore through the mayor and the chief of police in jail, issued martial law. Lincoln tells him to stay there. General Scott was pissed off beyond belief because there was no authority to do this. So this is a little bit of the geography. They're going from Boston down through Philadelphia, and he's on the last stretch, and he ends up, because he couldn't get through on the train, he goes down the river to Annapolis. It was a hotbed of secessionists. They were stockpiling military gear for the Confederacy. Gotta love these stories. Here's a trivia one for you. He sent one of his captains in disguised as an orchid Gregor, and I want to know, where did you get the monkey?
Same place you get the organ.
Yeah, really. And then he sat in the beer garden and issued a proclamation that everybody's got to follow the laws. Just for fun, he had 1,000 people up on Federal Hill pointing the cannons at the downtown area to try to pacify the place. And everybody was outraged in Baltimore, of course, but the northern press loved the guy. So, anyway, this is the view from Federal Hill. I don't know what Lincoln really thought of him. He promoted him shortly afterwards. So given his subsequent history with McClellan, you gotta enjoy a can-do guy, right? And he certainly was a can-do guy, as we'll see subsequently. Now I gave a talk, one of my talks is on Lincoln's secretaries. So Butler gets all dressed up in his finery and shows up at the White House to talk to Lincoln. He had a direct line to Lincoln. I never saw him wear quite so much uniform as he did when he came to pay his respects. And nobody ever doubted his energy. Nearly everybody doubted his character. He was endlessly useful and endlessly troublesome. Only Dickens could do justice to his remarkable combination of gifts, faults, and picturesque and fractuosities. And I'll let you look up what that means. Okay. Writing style was good back then. Okay, so it's pre-war. Now he gets his first big assignment. He's told go to Fort Monroe, which is down here, and Richmond is up the river and the Peninsula Campaign you probably know about. It was in the south, a key waterway. This is roughly what it looked like back then, so the fort's at the end. It was in terrible shape. A big part of the first months was just cleaning it up. And also his wife and kids came to visit. It was a key staging ground, so a lot of traffic. And 2 days after he got there was an opportunity to be a lawyer, because 3 slaves escaped from a Confederate captain and came over the boundary into the Union troops and wanted to be set free. Now, according to the previous legislation, he was supposed to give them back. But he decided to do a little lawyering, which was, these are not people according to you, they're your property, and you say you don't belong to the USA, so your rules don't apply anymore. And I'm allowed to take contraband, and this is property I can take from the slaves. So I'm going to hold them as long as you wage war against us. And word got around pretty quickly, so the number of black people coming into Butler camps was pretty astronomical, and he actually put them to work.
Just a little bit of feedback.
Yeah. So Fort Monroe, his fort became known as Freedom's Fortress. It's a nice cartoon. I love the cartoons at the time. Now, this created a little bit of problem for Lincoln. The rah-rah radical Republicans loved what Butler did once again, but Lincoln hadn't yet come up with a proclamation, Emancipation Proclamation. But Congress was rah-rah too, and approved an act allowing confiscation, so they more or less codified in law that you could do exactly what Butler had done. So he was kind of one step ahead of the game again. He worked the place into shape. He did do his first bungling here. So he had this master plan where he was going to send out 2 troops at night at Big Bethel, and the troops weren't particularly well led, and they weren't well trained, and they actually in the dark fired on each other and killed each other. So this 4 a.m. in the morning attack, and Butler was not there, so of course he's never at fault. He blames his bad commanders, but there were 18 people killed. In his view, brilliant plan, poorly executed by the 2 people in charge of it. Right after that, they bombarded Hatteras in North Carolina, Confederate fort. The Navy did the work, but Butler took the credit. So after 2 bungling things, Lincoln sent him home for a rest, okay, a timeout in modern parlance. However, he was very good at recruiting. So he went back and raised 6 more regiments. A regiment is 1,000 people, so pretty good contribution on the recruiting side despite the military bungling. Okay, now we go to the good stuff. You ready? Everybody good? You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Going too fast? No? Fine. Okay, so a little bit of background. Louisiana seceded in January. They grabbed the mint. They were the 6th biggest city and #1 in the South. So 168,000 people lived there. It was a moneymaker because they were the biggest shipment of cotton, and tobacco was pretty high on sugar. And they were the key target for Scott's grand anaconda plan, right? Suffocate the South. So actually the Navy commander came up with a plan for taking it. They kept McClellan and Butler out of the loop until the very last minute. And Butler's role was to take the Massachusetts guys, get on a ship and go to an island called Ship Island, get staged. The bombardment would be done by Porter, after which the Army guys come in and occupy the city and pacify it. So that was the master plan. It worked. David Farragut was one of the leaders with 45 ships and 2 forts well down the river from New Orleans. The city fell, and Butler marched his 15,000 troops in on May 1st. So here's a little picture of what they think the town looked like then. So, interactive time. If you were the general, what kind of problems do you think you faced?
Supply.
The populace didn't want to be, they don't want to have the Union, as they were.
Yeah, Confederates don't want a Union guy in charge of their town pretty clearly. What else?
Any food?
Food for the people? Yep. By the way, when the Confederate general left town, they took most of the food, leaving people to starve. What else?
Well, as a port city, wouldn't he have a problem getting cargoes in and customs revenues not done? And
Yeah, the question is, how do I run the city?
how do you run the city?
What,
Yeah.
what's the budget? What's the income? How do I keep any of that going when the whole plan is to embargo the main money-making source, cotton? Right?
Yeah.
I'm sure Washington DC is going to send money to help us, right? But they didn't. So he was kind of at his own financially, on top of all the military stuff. So the problems include, you're right, it's a belligerent city. The people are starving, and there's no work. And compounding that, all blacks are coming in, because this is Butlerville now, right? I don't have to stay on the plantation. By the way, yellow fever appears every year, so this is going to be a problem. And there's a money problem, there's a currency problem and a banking crisis. And there's a minor problem with foreign relations, so many of the other countries had consulates there, and they were decidedly pro-Confederate. So he was up against that too. They became annoying, but the main problems are here. His outcomes are he pacified the city, he did get a sound currency, he put people to work, and they got fed. The blacks were equally well fed and productive. He fixed the yellow fever problem, but the nemesis, as you will shortly see, would be those foreign consuls. They created huge problems for him politically. So here he is with his staff there in New Orleans. First thing was Farragut, the Navy guy, said, we want the flag to come down, the Confederate flag, and put up the US flag over the mint. The mayor refused, so they brought him in. They put the flag up, and this guy, William Mumford, age 42, tore it down, shredded it, So Butler had him arrested. They did a fairly quick military tribunal and ordered that he be hung. His widow came in with 3 kids begging for mercy, and he refused. The aftermath of that was Robert E. Lee gets an explanation on the military side. Jefferson Davis says Butler should be hung, and the papers are giving a $10,000 reward for his head. Okay? They were not happy. Too bad for Mr. Mumford. Now, later on, the postscript is people raised money for the widow and the kids, but she entrusted it to a clergyman to build her a house in Virginia, and he ran off with the money. So she was destitute. In 1869, she wrote Butler, got invited to D.C., and he helped get her a job at the Internal Revenue Service. So this is one of the first things where you're going to start changing your opinion, I hope. You've probably heard the women of the South did not care for him. They would lift up their skirts, or if soldiers got on a streetcar, they would all get off, or they would stand in the balconies and spit on people. They mooned Butler. His comment was, those women evidently know which end of them looks the best. There's a famous Order 28 that says, since we're being insulted regularly by the women who call themselves ladies, it's ordered hereafter that when any female, by word, gesture, or movement, insults or shows contempt, she will be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town, applying her avocation. In other words, we will treat her like a prostitute. How do you think this went down in the South? Let's just say not well. In fact, his staff was alarmed enough, they said, we can't do this. His reaction, and that our guys might molest women, he said, okay, but let's have one case of aggression on our side. I will know how to deal with it, so it will never be repeated. And the order went out exactly the way he wrote it, and there were no cases. So he was right. There was a rather large reaction in the papers. Even the Lord Palmerston in the British House of Commons basically says no one in the Anglo-Saxon race would dare treat women this way. They were all riled up, and they were trying to avoid the recognition of the Confederacy by the Brits. So this became a bit of a problem for Secretary of State Seward. Do you know what this is?
Yeah.
So the prostitutes got a picture of Butler and put it in their chamber pots. Their tinkle pots. Butler had a reaction to that too. He raided the red light district, grabbed all the potties, and the general wielded a hammer and smashed a few himself. He shut newspapers, except for the one that he made into the Army's newspaper. He had control over the churches. A few secessionist preachers that were kind of out there got sent to New York. He mandated loyalty oaths if you wanted to reopen your business, including Gina Benjamin's brother, and had to do it in front of Butler. And his approach to the foreigners and the consuls was, if you don't like it here, go home. Pretty blunt. Okay? Because a lot of people, all of a sudden, who had lived there for years, became French or Belgian citizens, even though they really weren't. Some of them were born there. So he needed money, and they didn't give him any money. So he actually got Lincoln to sign a confiscation act expanding the right of the military to confiscate property. And he took over this Southern general's house. And he also grabbed the property of John Slidell. Do you know what that is? You remember the big affair? What was it called? On the ships, where he was one of 3 Confederates going to England to work on recognition. So he grabbed his property and made the house available for staff to live in. So this did not go down well either, but whatever. Here's the spoon story. So people claimed that like he ransacked the house, he got the sword, he got the silverware, he grabbed everything. And Butler admitted he did grab some stuff, but like he sent the swords to President Lincoln, but he kept all the silverware, which he sent to his mother. He claims he paid for it. Who knows what the truth is? You know, a lady trying to cross lines, she got arrested, a smuggler. This was all contraband, so he could do, quote, petty looting and then sell it to get money. Because he really did need money. We'll talk about money in a second. Here's Lincoln congratulating him for cleaning up. So let me read it to you. Uncle Abe says, "Hello, Ben, is that you? Glad to see you." Butler says, "Yes." Uncle Abe got through with that New Orleans job, cleaned him up, scrubbed him up. Any more scrubbing you give up? So what this refers to is the meat marketplace was just infested with disease and a causative factor. So he actually had people with hoses and pumps clean out the meat market completely, and had some doctors come in and tell him how to get rid of yellow fever, which had killed about 8,000 or 10% of the population. So he flushed everything and gave workout, regular cleanings, and they only had 2 cases of yellow fever in 1862, which is a remarkable turnaround from previous.
Did they know the mosquitoes were causing the yellow fever?
I don't think they knew it. They just knew that filth attracted mosquitoes, and so they probably viewed the mosquitoes as an irritant, not a causative factor. But they really did not know. So he gave jobs to 2,000 people with rakes and hoes and shovels, and they got 50 cents a day and a full ration of food. He basically gave other people jobs whitewashing unpainted houses and cleaning up garbage, and inspectors were hired to run around and make sure that people took the garbage away. So it sounds like reasonably good administration. Right? They were poor and orphans, so like I said, they had grabbed all the food supply, and he blamed the war on the rich. Does this sound reminiscent of any political activity these days? Blame the rich. So they had burned 11,000 bales of cotton, and if they had sold it, that would have fed all of Louisiana. So on top of that, some of the city council people diverted a trust for orphans into buying munitions. So he basically brought these people in and gave them orders, like, you will repay the orphan fund, or I will be throwing you in jail. So the rich people had to fork over some of their own money. But wait, there's more. In fact, there's much more of what he did. So the orphans were getting fed, the poor were getting stuff. Before the war, and unfortunately for the rich people, their names were all in the paper. So he had a list of all the names of the people that had contributed to the Confederate city defenses. And order number 55 was a small tax of 25% on whatever you just donated to the Confederacy. Okay, that's going to go to the fund. And anybody who doesn't bring cotton into the city were fined $1,500, and that raised $350,000. And that wasn't quite enough. He started running out of money, so he did it again. They had to pay it again. So that's how he raised money, because he really wasn't getting anything, except scandals. And we'll get there shortly. Merchants who profited from blockade running were also taxed, fined, and his relief committee basically was keeping a quarter of the city population alive. Okay? Should we give Butler credit for a good job on the city administration? Probably. Now, the big problem was the money, because here's a $10 Confederate note issued by Citizens Bank of Louisiana. It's a Dixie note from the French word for 10. And the problem was these had to be backed by gold or silver that was held in the bank. However, he inspected and found that, guess what? A lot of that gold and silver, it wasn't at the bank anymore. So where was it? Well, they tried to hide it. So he issued an order that said all the banks have to discontinue paying anything in Confederate notes. Has to be paid in bills of the bank, treasury notes, gold or silver. He authorized new money, but they had to redeem all the previous one. And his quote to the bankers was, "You gentlemen who've got your gold concealed behind the altars, in the tombs, better get that money back in your own vaults pronto, because if you do not do that, and I find it," and there were plenty of informers, "then you're not going to get any of your money back." Okay? And he even promised, if you send people out, I will give you a guard to help you go get your hidden money and bring it back and put it in the bank. And here's the new US dollar. Greenbacks, obviously, because they're green. So one guy wanted a pass to go upriver. He gave him a pass. He comes back with $350,000 in gold packed in barrels of beef. He also wanted all the money of the United States that had been confiscated, and the total was $3 million. So the Confederates got $500,000 from the mint, $150,000 from the customs house, and there were $2 million of commercial transactions. Plus, he confiscated the money that the Confederacy had put in the banks. So he also picked up dollars there. So this guy was like a money-grabbing machine to help do all the good things that we just talked about. Now, I mentioned there's a little problem with the consulates. So here's how we talk about this one. So a black informant told him that there were a lot of kegs of money that got moved to a liquor dealer who was a Frenchman and was in a vault. So Butler sent his captain to talk to the guy who claimed he didn't know anything about it, and he was flying, despite the fact he was French, he was flying a Dutch consular flag, which normally would mean you do not have the right to send soldiers into a consulate and arrest anybody, but they did. And they actually stripped him down, and they got the key, and they found 800,000 in Mexican silver coins that were packed in these kegs, along with a bunch of other stuff. So, good job for Butler. He found more money that was being hidden away, and it was money that had come straight out of the bank. Right? It just got protected by the consul. Now, the people from the Dutch consulate complained officially to the United States in Washington, D.C., that this was not money that was available. It belonged to them, and it was paying for transactions for which they had paperwork with Holland. Okay, so this money. And Butler very quickly looked through that and decided, no, this is not true. They're actually using this money to pay for munitions for the South. And so he's going to grab it anyway. And he writes Stanton. I don't know, can you read this in the back or not? You can? Okay, I'll just give you a second to read it, and then we'll drink some water. Okay, pretty good. So that's what he was dealing with. That's what he was telling Stanton. I think Stanton believed him. This thing got escalated. It was becoming a big bad case. So Stanton talked to Secretary of State Seward. They apologized for the strip search and said they would investigate, and they did, but they kept the money. So in the meantime, all the other consuls, now they're starting to pile on too. This is Reverend Johnson was the guy that investigated. He actually had a problem with the Brits. He had a problem with the Greeks. The port did get opened up, but they were checking carefully what was happening and where the money was going. So they're shipping out sugar on a Greek vessel, He confiscated it because he thought that the money was, or the sugar was being exchanged for munitions, and that was all disputed. He waited to see who's going to come out of the woodwork, because this is like a multi-nation issue, so it's not just Greek people, it's the French, the Brits are in on it, and they let this guy decide. Another thing was at daybreak one day, on a Sunday, $716,000 went out of the bank under the guise of the French consulate. And Butler's reaction, his quote is, "The improbability of such a transaction, is not believable." And the Belgian consul got involved because part of all this money, it didn't all fit in the French consulate, and so they got the Belgian consulate to provide some room for all this money. So you can, the moral of the story is money in the banks is moving all over the place. It's being hidden. Basically, Butler's intent is to get it back and pay for things that need to be paid for. In this particular case, this count, the consul of France in New Orleans, says this is just a purely commercial transaction. No way is this intended to purchase arms. Here's my legal paperwork, and I, the great and powerful consul of France, certify blah, 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 blah. In reality, over in Belgium, the U.S. minister wrote back to Seward that there were shipments of military supplies for the Confederacy that were held up because they were waiting for the money to come in from New Orleans. So Butler was absolutely right on figuring all of this stuff up. And he basically wrote back and said, "I leave what you're going to do with the consul to the government, and I will punish everybody else, but I'm glad my action has been vindicated, and you should recall that. Demand that the French recall this lying SOB." That was Butler and the consul. The pro-union paper that he took over wrote this in an editorial. Read it. Okay. So that's what's going on. His last words: "Mr. Seward was in distress whenever I did anything that caused a little whippersnapper or emissary from some government to complain by unjust treatment, and this caused perpetual interference and annoyance. Otherwise, I was supreme, and having power, I used it." So a little bit of a dictator in New Orleans. In the meantime, and now we'll talk about potential corruption of Butler, he recognized that ships would come in and then they would be unloaded and you needed ballast. So why not foster trade in both directions? So things like guns might be coming in and then you need ballast. So why load it up with sand or stone when you can load it up with some cotton and turpentine, which I, Benjamin Butler, just bought, and then it will be taken up north and it can be sold. And this was a good arbitrage case. So the turpentine that was $3 that he bought it for sold for $38 a barrel in Boston. Sugar that was 3 cents was double that in New York City. And then flour up north for $6 could be brought back south. So all of these military ships that had extra space, Mr. Butler decided this was a revenue-making opportunity. But I'm just hoping, because we needed to load ballast anyway, right? Now, the quartermaster in Boston caught this swindle, notified the quartermaster Montgomery Meigs, and put a stop to all of this nonsense, right? There was another shipment that came in. So if you're Butler and you see this wonderful opportunity, but you can't be involved, what do you do? Come on, you know politicians, what do? You bring in the family. So Benjamin Franklin Butler had a brother named Andrew Jackson Butler, right? And he invited his brother to come help. So all of a sudden, Andrew was the purchasing agent. He would buy beef, bring them in, turn the bill into his brother, who would mark it up and promptly send it out to Washington for payment. Basically got the monopoly for Northern Flour. There was a calculation that Andrew basically made $1 to $2 million while in Louisiana. And when Butler got replaced by Nathaniel Banks at one point, his brother tried to bribe Banks with $100,000 if he would let all the shenanigans continue. So, nepotism in action. Secretary of the Treasury Chase sent in 2 customs people, and they confirmed everybody recognized the brother as the partner or an agent, and he's made a lot of money. So, for example, salt. There were 1,000 smuggled sacks of salt on Lake Pontchartrain. You had to have a permit from the general. The cost was $2, and all they did was go across the lake, and 400 of them were sold to the Confederate Army at $25 a sack, and 200 to civilians for $36 a sack. So now he's playing it with the enemy, which actually gets him into big trouble too. We'll see that again in a minute. So DC decided, between the diplomatic tensions that Butler was causing and the personal profiteering, time to pull the plug on Butler in New Orleans and replace him with another political general who actually was not that much better. If you know the Red River campaign, he kind of bungled his way all the way through that in Louisiana and Texas. Farragut, going back to the Navy guy at the very beginning, said, you can say what you want about him, but he was the right man at the right place, given all the problems. Okay, so that's New Orleans. Oh, a side note, I guess the motto for Louisiana politics is we don't tolerate corruption. With apologies to anybody from Louisiana. So, anyway, when you read this, if you get a copy of it, read all the details. Basically, the new general rescinded many of the things, so stopped the idea of you have to pay for permits, citizens can pass within the union lines, encouraged people to harvest crops. He evicted people from all those houses that they took over, a number of General Twigs and other places, reopened all the churches, and basically helped Seward because there was no more fighting with the foreign consuls. So that's what happened afterwards. Okay, so Butler's out of a job. What's he do? He goes directly to Lincoln and basically says he would like to be in charge of everything. Grant's army, for example, would be a good start in the West. But he didn't really want Grant's army. He wanted his old command back. Lincoln did not know what to do with Butler. Butler ran around and asked people, what are you saying about me? What are you saying about me? What are you saying about me? And concluded they were all lying. So he went back to Lowell for a little break. Because of what he did, everybody loved him. There were hurrahs, his reputation was high. You know, the House of Representatives, New York State, City of New York all sent congratulations on all of his accomplishments. And Lincoln actually, it's a handwritten letter that says, I think General Butler should go to New Orleans again. And send him back. And he never executed that. He put it in his drawer. But it shows that Butler was so effective that Lincoln was thinking of sending him back despite all the brouhaha with the foreign consuls. Okay, we're heading towards the finish line. Lincoln decided you can go back to Fort Monroe, and they renamed the Army of the James. And your main goal is to work with Grant, who is now launching a pincer movement. He's coming from the north, to go after Richmond and finish off the war. So that became the Overland Campaign. In the meantime, while he was home, he created 6 more regiments, some of whom were from Confederate prisoners of war, and he raised a regiment of colored troops. that saw combat in his war. He also was involved in prisoner exchange, but Grant suspended that for a variety of reasons. So here he is on the James River, but there's a part here, south of Norfolk, which is called the Great Dismal Swamp. And along the way, another story about Butler and corruption is area farmers would buy cotton from the south and then take them through the lines for family supplies. And here's a quote by Grant once he discovered what was happening, because Butler and his helpers were basically providing about 10,000 pounds of bacon, sugar, coffee, and codfish to Lee's army. About $100,000 of material per day was going through because Butler was letting all of that happen. And so Grant found out. So it's ironic that Grant was trying to cut off all of Lee's supplies, right? Many of the battles in the Overland Campaign were around supply chain railroads from the south. He's trying to stop it, and Butler was making money off of it. So the Bermuda 100 is called the cork in the bottle. I'll tell you what that means. So the part of the Grant game plan was for him, Butler, to go up and then attack Petersburg from the east, destroying rail links to the north, up to Richmond and take the turnpike, and basically force Lee into a multi-front battle. Grant didn't believe Butler on his own should lead it. He beefed up the army to 36,000 and assigned 2 major generals to lead it, because he really didn't want Butler involved. So Butler, of course, did get involved. He left in early May, City Point, onto the Bermuda 100. There were only 10,000 troops against 36,000 who should win a battle if you attacked right away. The Union. What did Butler do? Not attack right away. So he did it. And in the meantime, that gave enough time for the Confederates to reinforce. They got repulsed. And instead of attacking, which Grant certainly would have done, he dug in. So he had his men building entrenchments and being defensive instead of offensive. Right? However, the problem was a geography problem. So here's Grant and Lee coming down here, and here's Butler. And this thing here is called the Bermuda 100. See how the river goes out and around. And so he landed his people and did entrenchments here. And all the Confederates had to do was entrench here, and they had all the troops bottlenecked. And it didn't take that many troops to keep them. That's called the cork in the bottle. So he argued with his guys. Here he is at the Bermuda 100. Went defensive. Grant sent a brigadier general to see why he wasn't attacking. Here's actually his camp. Side note, he made use of the Gatling gun that nobody else was. And so there were 5, you can't read this, there were just 5 little skirmishes, and each time after the skirmish they went back to their defenses and weren't aggressive. So basically the investigators said they had the same line across that neck of land that Butler did, and he sketched it saying the position was like a bottle and the line of entrenchments were the cork, so it's like Butler's in the bottle. So it's called the Howell line, and if you've been there with a few big artillery pieces, you can keep it bottled up. So not his finest moments. So he basically along the way got called back because elections were happening in New York, and he did do a good job of pacifying the people in New York. He went with 3,500 people. Stanton wanted him to prevent disorder, so they were on ships in the harbor. And there was a plot to burn New York City, but they demoralized that entire conspiracy. So he did a good job of making sure that there were free and fair elections. Does that sound familiar? Free and fair elections. So Fort Fisher, again, is another fort down in North Carolina at the tip of the peninsula, and his assignment was to work with the Navy on a combination plan to take it. The Navy was going to come in and bombard it, and then he was supposed to land troops up here and then attack. And again, Porter is assigned. Butler comes in with a cool idea, like, why don't we just load up an old barge and stuff with a lot of gunpowder, and the Navy can tow it in and then blow up the fort, right? Didn't sound like a great idea. Grant scorned the idea that it relents, but basically just said, I still want the rest of the plan. You need to land, entrench, all your troops, and Butler decides he's got to do it his way. One of the soldiers said, "Old Butler is here and will perhaps command the expedition in order to assure its failure." Speaks volumes about the attitude of the troops under his command. So, of course, it's all screwed up. The troop transports didn't arrive. When they did arrive, the two parts of the attack weren't synchronized, so the Navy was ready, but they had to wait for the Army, and then Butler sailed on his own, but he didn't bring enough supplies, so he went back to Beaufort. And then the Navy decided, okay, let's go blow things up, and they did, but it didn't have any impact, and Butler wasn't there, so he just fired all day. And then when Butler did show up, he didn't land all of his troops, he only landed a third of them, and then kind of stranded them. So getting back to Butler as a military general, not too good at taking and executing orders. So Grant had it. He basically said, I want this guy out of here. You know, in my absence, he necessarily commands, and there's lack of confidence in military ability, making him an unsafe commander. So Lincoln, on January 7th of 1865, pulled the plug on Butler altogether. What does Butler do? Should know it well enough by now. It doesn't go down easy, right? Where's he go? Congress. Congress had this group on the conduct of the war, and they would have hearings, right? They were kind of a thorn in the side of the different generals because they were micromanaging the war. So he shows up at a hearing of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, and he focused on why his plan was totally reasonable, and in any case, the fort was impregnable, and it would require a long siege. What he did not know was, in the meantime, another order went out with a revised plan with other players, with Porter and a guy named Terry, and they captured the fort while he was testifying, and a kid came in, and Butler looked foolish because the kid was saying, you know, we took a fort in Fisher. So despite all of his politicking with the committee, it didn't really work. After the war, he continued to politic. I like this cartoon the best. The Massachusetts voters, he had been in the House and the Senate. They did elect him to Congress. He does switch to the Democratic Party. He lost the governorship, then he won it, and then he ran for president badly. He was, when he ran in 1866 for the U.S. House, he pledged to impeach Johnson. In fact, he was the impeachment manager. So he used his lawyer skills there, and they lost by one vote. He wrote an anti-Grant piece trying to scuttle his nomination, but it never got published. And of course, playing everything on both sides, he becomes Grant's buddy and helps with who should be put in which positions. And the reactions were, the worst appointments made by Grant were at Butler's suggestion, and the worst acts of Congress were passed under Butler's weapons. But that's not totally fair, because he did do some good things. I'm sure he is crying. I love the cartoons, they're really good. He controlled a lot, you know, money, patronage, votes. When he was running, because of that little spoons problem of stealing stuff, people would get behind him at rallies with spoons to remind everybody. He did, on the good side, get the first version of the Ku Klux Klan Act passed and the first Civil Rights Act. And he did fight for a 10-hour workday and protecting women and children. So not all bad. Here he is campaigning. He did do a variety of things, like some of the farms that got confiscated. He made them into co-ops to give jobs to African Americans. Sponsored a scholarship for an African American student at Phillips Andover, and he was an executive with the National Home for Disabled Volunteer Soldiers. So some good things. Let's get that. Here's his gravesite. It was estimated at his death, he inherited his brother's estate, but he was worth about $7 million when he died. That was a lot of money. That'd be $210 million today. So think about that. So, how do you feel about Benjamin Butler now? There were some good things, there were some bad things, there were some pretty awful things. I grabbed content from all over the place. He wrote his own autobiography, which is 1,000 pages long. I did not have the time and energy to read that. These books are pretty good. There's the brand new book that I talked about on the left. So a lot of the stories in the magazine article, it's an excerpt from the book I already had in this talk. Here's the magazine article. And then there are a variety of other things. So if you'd like to read, just get the PDF and follow these leads. But like I said, a lot of people are starting to publish things like this guy wasn't so bad after all, which I define. A really intriguing free thing that you could look at would be this little 44-page write-up, which will give you a little more in-depth on a few of the stories that I told you today. So that's your talk on Butler. I have given, thanks. Janet in the introduction talked about the rest of the story. A lot of you are old timers. Do you know where that comes from? Do you remember the radio where the tagline was, and now the rest of the story around it, right?
Paul Harvey.
Paul Harvey, right. So what I try to do is focus on topics where it's not the battle, it's the other stuff that was happening. And if you look at the list of talks here, you'll get an idea of some of the things. I particularly like, I was talking to somebody beforehand, the quartermaster and commissary number 4 is really good. And the West Point connections that were made, all the guys that went to West Point then went off to the battles, and the Mexican War was kind of training ground. But a lot of them knew each other or were even roommates, but ended up on either side. So there are some very interesting stories there. If you would like a copy of the PDF, you can ask Janet, I'll give it to her, or you can just write me directly. It's my name with DR in front of it at gmail. Okay, questions over here?
I was just going to say that maybe a title should be from Walt Whitman, where he says, very well, I contradict myself, I am large, I can tell you multitudes. And I think this fits well. And you might want to look at Walt Whitman, fourth idea, as a Civil War nurse and observer of Lincoln, etc.
That'd be a good talk.
Yeah.
We just had lots of good ideas. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Other questions? How do we do on time? I wasn't paying any.
Excellent. We got 15 minutes to go.
Yep.
You mentioned Greek involvement in the Civil War. What was that about?
Just shipping.
Oh, okay.
So
They owned the ships.
Yeah, I mean, it was the biggest southern port, so they were shipping cotton. It was before Egyptian cotton. Right? So people who needed sugar, cotton, tobacco to some extent. Any of the goods out of the south were being shipped to Europe, South America, other places. Yep.
How did the union try to control shipping and to make sure that, things were not just going to the Confederacy? Did they have someone particularly in charge of that?
Yeah, permits, inspections. Almost any commerce that happened had fees associated because he needed his money for the orphans, supposedly. Right. So they inspected everything that came in. Yep.
Is it fair to guess that he had more leeway to do what he did in New Orleans because he was so far from DC and there was no telegraph, I presume? He didn't have adult supervision immediately. Was he at the end of a long and distant communication line, or was he in close contact with DC?
Incidentally, I gave a talk earlier this afternoon on the telegraph system. So it was very hit and miss because, like, the picture that I have in the other talk shows how did Sherman get information back to Washington, D.C., and it had to go by way of Cairo, Illinois, then up through Indianapolis, Columbus, Philadelphia. So it's like 4,000 miles, not 1,600 miles if you were to drive it or fly it. But the problem was, once you put up the telegraph line, you had to defend it. And it was right along with the railroads, almost always, because the original telegraph lines were there because if you had one track, you had to make sure you didn't have two trains running into each other. So as they extended their supply chains, they needed to defend the railroad anyway, and it's highly likely that they were able to keep the telegraph lines up and running. It took a huge number of people to defend these things, but by doing that, as they came down and took over and repaired southern railroads that got destroyed, then they had a potential communication route back. But at any point in time, Morgan's Raiders could come through, jump the line. There were, in the talk today, it was easy to tap into a line. Okay? Now, that's why they had to encrypt everything. But there are great stories in that first talk, second talk that I gave. One guy from Kentucky who knew the other telegraph guys before the war had the ability to mimic the way that they did Morse code. And so he could splice in. His name was Lightning Ellsworth. And then on behalf of Morgan, who was Morgan's telegrapher, he would pass out what looked like Union instructions of we're going to go here, or Morgan's instructions, we're going to go, we think Morgan's going this way, and totally mislead the Union Army to go the wrong direction. But to get back to your question, I think the lines of communication in the beginning were not very good, but as they took over more of the Mississippi Valley, they were able to communicate more rapidly or get information on a ship that would be going to a port where they had a functioning telegraph line. Right? It wasn't a direct line. You didn't pick up your iPhone and call the White House. So, other questions? Yeah.
Where was the nearest Confederate military stronghold that could have potentially tried to retake New Orleans?
That's a good question. Well, he took over in 1862, if I remember all the dates right. And by 1863, the Confederates were in trouble because of Vicksburg being the last remaining part. So they had lost New Orleans, and they were trying to hang on to selected islands and selected forts along the Mississippi, but they were being taken over. Bragg was in Tennessee, North Georgia, but he had his own problems. He was supposed to come to the rescue and didn't happen, and then he got replaced by Joe Johnston. So I guess if I had to guess where the closest stronghold was, it was probably to the north in Tennessee.
Or Lloyd on the river.
Yeah, or the river. Yeah. But he was relatively safe because he had 15,000 guys, and it was not too hard to defend New Orleans, using some of the same fortifications that they had beforehand. So it wasn't like they were going to, not like the Confederates had a big navy anyway that was going to come up the river and hit them. So it wasn't too hard. But that's a good question. I should go research it.
Did Butler ever try to ameliorate his strabisma?
What was that?
Did Butler ever try to ameliorate his strabisma?
His
This
charisma?
process, was there any way to solve that at that period of time?
I don't think so.
Oh,
Before,
Before Butler was, did the South manage to get some slave ships in New Orleans? 'Cause I know they were bringing in slaves.
yeah, I assume they probably did.
I think South Carolina or something after New Orleans was taken.
Yeah.
We managed to still get in a few ships, but that was some days ago.
Right. She wanted to know if you can hear whether slave ships were still coming in before Butler showed up. I assume they were then slave goods and stuff like that. Okay. All right, hope you were entertained.